Hello there, this is Doc for 6DOF Reviews. It's a shame for their respective developers that two city-building games have arrived on the Quest in a very similar release window. For us here at 6DOF Towers, however, it works quite well, allowing us to compare and contrast two titles with an ostensibly similar modus operandi, but very different approaches. Cities VR is the Quest iteration of the famous flat game Cities Skylines, and it's been given quite the fanfare, being one of the titles featured on Meta's recent underwhelming showcase reveal. Little Cities is, appropriately, the underdog here, an unassuming indie title that doesn't have anything like the exposure or provenance of its similarly titled genre rival. Ironically, the original Cities Skylines was, in its day, the challenger to a more established franchise's throne, conceived as a more playable and approachable and less bloated alternative to the corporate mess that SimCity had become. Will this be a David and Goliath tale of pluck and guile winning out against sheer might? Both titles are city-building management games, viewed from an aerial perspective. They feature the usual mix of laying roads, zoning infrastructure, providing utilities and services for the residents, and keeping the population happy and the books balanced. These types of games may be familiar to most gamers, be the reaction love, loathing or indifference, but it's a genre weirdly underrepresented in VR. On the Quest, there's Deism on App Lab or SideQuest, which is really more of a streamlined god game than city management, and of course the lovely Spacefolk City, which our own Pete Austin fell in love with a little while ago. And that's all that comes to mind. Please feel free to remind me in the comments of any others I might have overlooked, but I think I'm right in saying that it's a curious gap. With the 6 degrees of freedom, God's eye view, and VR's potential immediacy of control, you'd think the Quest would be dripping with city builders and god games. If this video was purely a review of Cities VR, then I think it would go some way to satisfying my own puzzlement about the dearth of this type of game on the Quest. To put it simply, Cities VR isn't very good. That's not because it doesn't have quite the feature set of the original Cities Skylines, far from it. There's nothing wrong with streamlining an experience for VR. Given that statistics and reams of information are easier to parse on a flat monitor display, it's a mercy that there might not be so much to keep track of in the heady confines of VR. And Cities VR is more than complex enough in this regard, needlessly and to a fault. It's never a good sign when the game's first screen is a pixelated, dreary still of the developer's logo. And so it is with Cities VR. And it does set the tone for what's to come. The game is overall clunky and unfriendly for new players. The tutorial highlights everything wrong with the game rather incisively. The controls are finicky and never feel intuitive. The radial flick to select different categories of buildings and materials just feels off. There are comfort and movement options to tweak, but they aren't nearly comprehensive enough, and even at the highest sensitivity, the smooth turning is painfully slow. Tutorial pop-ups stick themselves right in front of your view like a pissed and over-familiar uncle at a wedding, and most of them obfuscate their intent enough to infuriate. It took me 4 attempts to get through just the tutorial, and it was maddening. The sound effects, great. The worst offender is the clicky-clacky noise which plays incessantly when building a road or a pathway. It's quite incredibly misjudged. You'll hear hours and hours of it through the game, and it's like sandpaper for the frontal lobes. After prolonged exposure, you'll want to find whichever cartoonish tap dancer provided the original sample and beat them to death with their own shoes. Cities VR lets itself down almost consistently in terms of presentation. Little here resembles the lush, clean-looking title touted in the Meta Showcase. The literal building blocks of the game are janky. Buildings under construction look like pixelated progress bars, and the colour palette is all over the shop. The interface does all it can to make you feel like you're doing something wrong, or pressing the wrong button nearly all the time. And then it proves it to you. The graphics are substandard with huge amounts of pop-in even before you start to build your city. Shadows are so blocky and ugly that you wonder why they're there at all. It all seems a bit placeholder and alpha, which is unforgivable for a modern and full-priced top-tier Quest title. There's a lot to do in Cities VR, although perhaps thankfully not as much as there is in its parent flat game. The problem is that it's actually unpleasant to do most of it, and I'm afraid that it might take more than an update or two to put the problems right. This brings us to Little Cities, and a more fascinating comparison or pleasing about turn cannot be made. I think it's fair to say that Little Cities is, despite sharing a genre, the antithesis and antidote to Cities VR's sinful use of the Quest. Developed by Purple Dragon, a husband and wife team in the UK, LC is being touted as a cosy and accessible city-building game. Everything about Little Cities is pleasing, from the benign music to the sharp, crisp and appealing graphical style. The tutorial is not only painless, but fun, an ongoing and welcoming experience which efficiently introduces everything you need to know to play the game in a pacey way. Whereas Cities VR starts off convoluted and prissy to control, Little Cities is a simple joy to whiz about in. The navigation is clever and effortless, the controls rely on pointing physically at bubbles, drawing clean grid lines, and clicking for construction. Rather like the wonderful Tentacular, it's one of those titles that makes you feel that some developers really are getting to know what works in VR and are tailoring the experience to be as delightful, interactive and virtually tactile as possible. This game gives you plenty to smile about as you play it. Seeing cars beetling about on the roads and buildings slowly taking shape is a pleasure. All of the information you need to know to assess the needs of the burgeoning city is easy to access and kept concise. It's just like checking your watch. After a couple of days away, I didn't dread having to relearn any complex mechanics, and the interactions became, and remained, second nature. If there are awards for UI in VR, then Little Cities really needs to win some of them. By containing its ambition a little, LC manages to achieve everything it sets out to do in style, providing an engrossing and gentle city-building experience which is a delight from the minute that you fire it up. The contrast between this and Cities VR could not be starker. In summary then, scoring Cities VR, I'd have to give it 4.5, with marks definitely deducted for noticeably poor use of VR. Little Cities is by far the better game of the two, and in fact one of the loveliest games on the Quest per se. David definitely bests Goliath in this instance, with a well-aimed, well-deserved 9.